very good morning to everyone here. It's great to see so many familiar faces in the audience. Now, the MES's Managing Director, Chia Dejin, just spoke about the notable commitments that we saw at COP28. This includes the launch of the Loss and Damage Fund. Now, behind me, hopefully it shows up, you will see some other key sustainable finance initiatives that have been launched recently. Now, all these things, they're important commitments, but with an annual net zero financing gap of $3.5 trillion, I'm sure the question on everyone's minds is how do we turn commitment into action? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the central question that our keynote panel will address this morning. Beyond the headlines and the standard talking points, what are the challenges that we face? And of the many, many things that we need to tackle, what are perhaps one or two key things that we need to address first that will really have maximum impact? And last of all, how can public, private, and philanthropic actors work together on this? So this morning, we are indeed privileged to have a truly distinguished panel, and they really need no further introduction. Dylan, Philip, and Mark, they bring a wealth of perspectives, knowledge, experience, and expertise, all of which are really central to our efforts to get financing to transition. So, gentlemen, let's first talk about the challenges that we're facing. Now, the world is currently facing a polycrisis of interconnected challenges, everything from trade fragmentation to slower economic growth. This has definitely put global climate action at some risk. At the same time, fiscal budgets have also come under strain, which means that more now than ever, we need to urgently mobilize private capital at scale. So the question I have for each of you is, what are the key impediments to mobilizing private capital for climate financing? What are the key impediments? Philip, perhaps we can start with you. What are you seeing at the global macro level?
Thank you, Gillian, and thank you for having me here in Singapore. It's wonderful to be back. Great to be with the two friends and distinguished panelists up here. Look, at the macro level, I'd say we are facing a challenged macro environment. That's stating the obvious. What makes it challenged, and it's very different from the last decades, is of course that we have supply constraints throughout the world, which leads to higher for longer, to put it in a kind of distinct way. Even the chairman of the Federal Reserve yesterday acknowledged that that's likely the scenario we're facing. And that means everything is a bit more difficult. On top of this, beyond the macro side of things, we have, of course, a reordering of priorities for most governments. Climate risk is not the only priority that they're addressing. They have to address energy security risk, which is a big issue, very big issue, consequential issue. National security risks, of course, have come back to the forefront of the agenda. And as that happens, between energy security, national security, climate security, there's no doubt that we're seeing a kind of reordering, to put it mildly, I'd say, of national policy priorities. And that, as you suggested, I think, means that the fight to make progress towards a fair and just transition has become more difficult. I think we need to acknowledge that, and therefore it becomes even more important to think of innovative ways to mobilize private capital. The final point I'd make at the macro level, and you referred to it, Gillian, is that all of this is happening at a time when fiscal capacities of countries are stretched. We are now approaching, we're very close at the global level to 100% debt to GDP ratio. If you look at the United States, it's heading towards 130%, rapidly increasing. And that is the story of many, many countries across the world. Of course, the legacy of these crises that you've referred to in the beginning. And so all of this has to occur at a moment when the public side is stretched, no matter how you look at it. And I think what that tells me is that, and again, you made reference to it, and the many initiatives up there are trying to address this, the priority that we all face, and all three of us, I think, are deeply engaged in this effort, is how do we mobilize private capital at scale using the limited public money that we have available in order to incentivize, mobilize private capital. I think that is the predominant challenge in a way if we want to get anywhere near meeting the commitments that many of our governments or most of our governments have made. So I think that is really the key challenge, and it's more important than ever before. It's more important than even a couple of years ago, given this reordering of national priorities and given the supply constraints, given the hard macro environment, and given the limited amount of fiscal capacity that most countries face.
No, thanks, Philip. So it sounds almost like a double whammy of sorts, right? You've got this reordering of priorities, more priorities, and very stretched resources. And that's quite potentially a deadly combination. Thank you for that. Dilan, turning to you, are there impediments or challenges that are top of mind for you?
So I think just to follow up from what Philip said, I think we're coming into a very challenging period in recent history, I think not seen since probably the 70s, and a confluence of different factors, all of which make the cost of doing anything much higher than we could have anticipated just a few years ago. If you think about it, just a few years ago, we were looking at a low inflation, low interest rate environment. That would have been more conducive to talk for an energy transition discussion. Today, we're looking at inflation being higher for longer, as Philip mentioned. And one of the reasons is that geopolitics has a significant influence on that. The risk of some form of decoupling, will also be inflationary, whether you look at reconfiguration supply chains or otherwise. Rising populism, nationalism, protectionism has that element. If you look at muscular industrial policies that we're seeing around the world, that has inflationary aspects, and yet we have to deal with the climate crisis. So the real issue for us is where's the finance coming from to get us to where we want to go. We all know the goal, 2050 net zero. We know that we need to do things between now and 2030 to be able to meet that goal. But the real question is availability of finance to catalyze action to get us to where we want to be. And as was mentioned, you have this confluence, hopefully, of public finance, private capital, and philanthropic capital. But all of which also have now different requirements as compared to, say, just a few years ago. So public finances are stretched for the reasons that I've mentioned. And of course, the fact that we have conflicts in two parts of the world doesn't help with that issue as well. But private capital is also constrained as well, because in a low interest rate, low inflation environment, and where cost of capital is lower, there's more capital available to do things which have a premium associated with it, as energy transition has, for example. And I think that the reality is that today, if we look at philanthropic capital, people are very focused on outcomes. And they do want to ensure that the money is used for good purposes, and there is an ability to recycle the capital that's available. So whichever way you look at it, the amount of capital available is somewhat more constrained than it was just a few years ago. Having said that, the ambition is still there. But there are a whole lot of conflicts, right? We do have no agreed global taxonomy. We don't have global frameworks in place to allow for the transition to happen, not just in developed markets, but also in emerging markets. Emerging markets face this issue which is quite different from developed markets. Developed markets look at energy transition, and side by side, they look at energy security. In emerging markets, it's energy transition versus energy affordability. And the question for energy affordability is critical to emerging nations, especially if you think about economic development, the national need, and in fact the international need to ensure that uplifting of populations around the world, of communities, and that's a challenge for them. And so if the financing is to come from within, we're not going to get there. So the financing is to come from outside, and to do that, you need to have people able to deploy capital at scale. And that's the issue, deploying capital at scale. And the challenge, of course, for energy transition is that there's so much of fossil fuel-based energy, especially in Asia, which is relatively new. So if we look at the average age of coal-fired power plants, especially in, say, Southeast Asia, it's anything between 12 and 15 years. To retire these coal-fired power plants or do a managed phase down or phase out is humongously expensive. Without multilateral development banks coming in, without private capital being able to being prepared to put capital at risk, without concession capital being available, that's the magnitude of the problem is actually there. And so we all have to weigh in and figure out a way in which we can overcome the barriers which are external to allowing this capital to be mobilized to where it needs to go to achieve the objectives that we have. So Asia faces a particular problem in that respect.
Yeah, so some very deep challenges that you flagged, Dylan, thank you. When we think about capital, it's both constrained and therefore scarce in this time. But at the same time, each part of capital has its own requirements and risk, tolerances and return requirements. So very, very challenging to deploy at scale, which, as you said, is really the key ask here. Mark, turning to you. So Mark, you co-founded the 3 Cans Group, which is an investment and philanthropic firm that looks at investing in scalable solutions at the intersection of, I think, climate, finance, and people. A very ambitious project. What is the biggest challenge that you have seen in your work?
I think the biggest challenge relates directly to what Dylan and Philip were talking about, which is the size of the problem and the size of the opportunity. If in the emerging markets, on an annual basis, there's a need for about $2.4 trillion, and we're about $1.6 trillion short on an annual basis. What are we going to do about that? That is the number one challenge. And for our firm, what we're focused on is first loss equity capital that shares pari passu on the upside. So if the fund we invest in makes money, then we also, our investors, make money. The reason to do that, we believe, is that is the best way to mobilize a lot of capital. It isn't a solution to the challenge, but it's an opportunity to get a lot of capital moving quickly. And I can talk more about that, but I think that's the number one thing. How do we get more junior equity? Equity drives the world. Equity drives the world. We need to figure out a way to get more equity into projects that are at scale related to climate. And if we don't do that, then we won't be able to close that gap. If we do, we have a shot at closing the gap.
Thanks. Yeah, no, that's great. So the need for capital, especially junior capital, but also being mindful that, while the problem is large, so is the opportunity. I love that. So you've each flagged some very real challenges. I think this audience, are quite familiar. They're quite familiar with challenges, and it's really important that we get down to solutions. So let's move to that and turn first to things that the private sector can do. Now, we've talked about the size of the problem before us, some of the challenges that we are all familiar with regard to the different parts of capital and how they feature in the capital stack, as well as the opportunities that are present here. So, Dylan, when I think of this, I think of Pentagreen, which is a platform that Temasek and HSBC launched to finance marginally bankable green infrastructure in Asia. So really building on this and perhaps going a bit more broadly, how do you think the private sector can take the lead in mobilizing some of this financing that's needed? And how is Pentagreen addressing some of the challenges that we just talked about?
So I think, first of all, the private sector, I'm not sure the private sector can take the lead, but I definitely think the private sector has a role to play working with the public sector to come up with solutions. And the reason why the private sector can't take the lead is because so much of what we're thinking about and what we're talking about requires policy frameworks. And private sector needs to ensure there's a predictable policy framework to have that capital being deployed at scale. So a few things I think we should be focused on. First of all, is that historically, especially in emerging markets, many of the infrastructure projects which are necessary have been marginally bankable or unbankable. The same thing with energy transition projects, right? It's an extension of really building out the infrastructure for energy transition. And so what we need to do is to focus on how we can get the marginally bankable projects bankable, and get the bankable projects, unbankable projects less unbankable. Okay, so I'll put it that way. So if we were to focus on marginally bankable projects, there are a few things that are needed in particular. One is policy frameworks, which countries need to put in place. And that requires also the assistance of the multilateral development agencies, because they have a big role to play. They have deep expertise in various sectors that are useful for these emerging markets. They also have the ability to advise on the policy frameworks, to provide training to administrators for these policy frameworks. All those can be put in place. Now, then comes the question of technology. Okay, technology is very, very important. Technology is going to accelerate the ability to find solutions, especially in the hard-to-abate sectors. And you have to figure out how to scale up the technology quickly enough so that you bring down the carbon abatement cost curve to a level where it can be deployed at scale. And so climate tech is an important part. The second thing, of course, is that you need to invest growth capital in the transition, which means if you look at, say, managed phase-out of coal-fired power plants, it's both the phasing down or phase-out, as well as the new generation capacity you need to put in place. Now, where does Pentagreen fit in this? Well, we know that most banks are involved in sustainable finance, but that's really bankable sustainable financing propositions. It focuses on the marginally bankable projects, because if it's bankable, the banks can actually address that issue quite clearly. So for the marginally bankable projects, aside from policy issues that are beyond the remit of Pentagreen, is the fact that the capital structure can be looked at in a way in which you can provide the missing gap, whether that's mezzanine finance or otherwise, to make sure that the bank financing is available to allow the sponsors to get a decent return on capital deployed. Or you can actually provide some level of blended concessionary returns-oriented capital. So far, the first project Pentagreen has done is where it's provided mezzanine finance, and it structured the deal where it brought a number of other assets in as part of a security package to allow for the underlying financing, bank financing, to become more bankable. And so it takes more risk that the banks do because of the mezzanine part, but of course it's higher up in the capital stack than the equity. And as a result of that, in its first project, which was in the Philippines, which actually relates to 6 solar projects in the island of Luzon, they were able to give a commitment up to $100 million and immediately deployed $30 million to catalyze another $300 million of financing. So that's sort of the range, right? $30 million gets you $300 million of financing, so it's 1 to 10, which is a huge issue. So if we can have more and more institutions focus on that sort of structuring, perhaps we can find the solutions to bridge part of the gap that arises in allowing for marginally bankable projects to become bankable. So that's Pentagreen. I would say that if I was just looking at energy transition in, say, Southeast Asia and looking at coal-fired power plants, I think we need a mix of many different things. Okay, so I talked about policy frameworks. Will carbon tax be put in place for new coal-fired power plants such that you disincentivize coal-fired power plants for new capacity? Can you max out renewable energy capacity in a country? That doesn't mean just building a renewable energy plant, whether it's a solar plant or wind farm or whatever it is. It includes the infrastructure, the grid infrastructure. It includes battery storage. Okay, it includes the fact that you have to ensure grid stability, grid management systems, train people for the new grid that you're going to put in place, and the interconnectors that come in place. The other thing about it is that you've got to figure out where the finance is coming from for that sort of infrastructure. The financing will come in place for the renewable energy, but what about the grid? Who's financing the grid? Generally, countries finance the grid. Can the World Bank and multilateral development agencies contribute to that? Can, say, for example, Altera, and through its 3 different initiatives, contribute towards that? Therefore, can private capital come in? Then comes the issue of truncating the cost of capital that's required to have the transition. And because coal-fired power plants may be under PPAs, which are quite lucrative, renewable energy power plants therefore need to be of a magnitude of the power generation capacity being phased down to make it viable financially. Yeah. Because you've got to make sure the profit pool truncates the cost of capital. And then you need to think about the concessionary capital that goes in there to really close the gap. And that also brings to mind the issue of transition credits. And the transition credits have got to be of the highest quality possible, because those transition credits actually relate to future events happening, because the phase down is happening many years down the road after the renewable energy plants come up. And let's face it, you need the energy to still be produced by the coal-fired power plants, because it's being used for industry in those countries, rural communities, urban communities, etc. You can't just switch it off. So you've got to put all these things together and package them and put it forward. That is actually the real nub of the issue. So Panagreen is trying to play its part in providing some part of the financing stack, and hopefully it will catalyze others to come in, either do what it's doing or do something which helps the other pieces to come together to achieve that objective.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There's just so many pieces to this puzzle, right? And on transition credits, I mean, the MES put together this coalition called Traction, precisely to look into some of the issues that you cited. And that timing mismatch has come up in some of the work. And we're looking to think about solutions, across, supply, so integrity, building demand for these credits, as well as, in the middle, right? How do you scale these transactions? So, not easy, and it's good that Pentagreen is alongside us, I think, in this journey. But Philip, if I can turn to you, something Dylan said really struck me. In Asia, when you think about private investments in energy transition, generally this seems to be largely in renewables. I mean, even the Pentagreen example that Dylan mentioned is in solar. But as Dylan rightly pointed out, actually the region needs much more than just renewable energy. There's grid modernization, there's storage, and of course the phasing out of coal plants as well. But these are not always the most readily investable areas. As we think through it, what are the obstacles faced by private capital, private investors who might be thinking about jumping into some of these areas? And what can be done to really catalyze more investments in these more challenging sectors and areas?
It's a very good question. Last night, I had the opportunity to sit with 3 different investments, companies where we made investments in the renewable space, one in Thailand, one in the Philippines, and one in Bangladesh. And on the one hand, it actually left me more optimistic than when I look at the macro picture, when you hear from people who work on the ground successfully, get these projects launched, cut through the red tape, and so forth. And I think one of the things perhaps we should do more of, Mark and I were talking about it this morning, is to have kind of almost a transparent, registry where we could see projects on the ground to learn from actual experiences. Sometimes I think we get stuck just thinking of the complexity of the kind of big problem, losing sight of the fact that there are people out there making successful investments. But one of the things that resonated from essentially all of them last night in this discussion was that in order to attract private capital, you need fundamentally kind of market-based approach in these countries, particularly when it comes to the energy system at large. So where you have nationalized systems, nationalized grids, it becomes very difficult. You can create the projects, you can create the renewable energy, but then, you struggle connecting it to the grid. And that seems to be one of the big challenges in many Asian countries, Southeast Asia in particular. The Philippines, I think, have made a big transition there. That's been very powerful. So that seems to now open up, a lot of capital coming in. So I think this question on the policy framework around power, and the grid in particular, and to make that as market-based as possible so that you can attract capital that is interested not just in producing the energy, but also in making sure that you can connect it to the grid. I think that's one of the very important things. And then secondly, I would say we just need to, we need to experiment. I've always been impressed by John Kerry and his kind of appetite for just trying things, right? So these blended finance vehicles, Mark is focused on this. We have been very focused on it. There are now a number of different versions of it. Altera, there is the Climate Finance Partnership that you mentioned up front. That is an investment vehicle that we've launched with a 20% kind of first loss risk reduction, funded by Philanthropic and Catalytic Sovereign Capital. The Insurance Development Forum that was announced last week, where we're going to work with leading insurance companies to try to find new ways of using catalytic capital on the debt side. These are all examples, and I think we just need to launch them, try them, and when they work, then focus on how do we scale them. I think this was our discussion this morning. We actually know how this works. Many of these things work on a small scale. Bill Gates will tell you the same thing on the innovation front. On the technology side, most things now work in a lab environment. How do we scale it up? And I think some of the efforts that the MAS is involved in, Temasek, we are, Mark is involved in this, to launch projects where we have proof of concept at a relatively small scale, and then find ways to scale it up by using limited amount of public money in a smart way to reduce the risk. You have to remember, at the end of the day, and I think this is the overall challenge, if we want capital markets to kind of come at scale to fill this gap that Mark pointed out at the very beginning, what we're really talking about is, to a large extent, these are pension assets, one way or another. In order for pension assets to go to these places that Mark pointed out at the beginning, we're going to need to have risk reduction. We need to find ways to bring the risk levels down to something like OECD risk. Otherwise, you lock out a major part of the global capital markets. And given the numbers that you mentioned in the beginning, we simply can't afford to do that. So I think those are some of the key challenges that I see.
No, absolutely. And I see great alignment between what you just said, Philip, and what Managing Director Chia said earlier, which is moving from pilots to scale. And I think Altera is certainly not small peanuts, right? It seeks to mobilize, I think, $250 billion between now and 2030. So that's a very, very good start, I think, down that spectrum. Now, we've spoken quite extensively about private sector moves. Let's shift gears a bit and move to the public sector. So governments, MDBs, regulators, policymakers, and so on. And we've already covered some of this in the discussion. I think we mentioned policy frameworks, including how this can help energy transition. But what else can we think about? So Mark, turning to you, I know both you and Dylan, but you'll take this one for Dylan, I'm sure. You're both founding members of the World Bank Private Sector Investment Lab. Actually, BlackRock is also represented there through Larry Fink. Mark, can you share with us about what the lab is trying to achieve and what might be some sort of key priorities moving forward?
Julian, I want to talk about the Private Sector Investment Lab in 1 second, but I just want to follow up on what Philip just said and Dylan alluded to. This idea of pilots and then scale. Okay, very briefly, there was a small pilot done here in Singapore a number of years ago by Climb Capital, a $22 million fund focused on early stage capital. That $22 million, so small, went into 10 projects in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam. And that has scaled about 25 times its money. We then took that project that Climb ran, called Southeast Asian Clean Energy Fund 1, made Southeast Asian Clean Energy Fund 2, and it'll be a $175 million fund. So we've taken a pilot that worked well, scaled it, and that fund is able to get a very large multiple and have, in this case, not all philanthropic capital, but have the philanthropic capital be the first junior 25%, and then the MDBs, DFIs of the world be senior to that capital. So this is an exact example, I think, of this idea of scaling, scale more, and then do it again and again. So we are trying to do that both in similar structure in India, in Africa, the Caribbean, Central America, and other markets of the world. On the World Bank Private Sector Lab, we have a new leader at the World Bank in Ajay Banga. And Ajay, I think, is the right person for the moment. He has gathered 15 CEOs from around the world to talk to him about, and his team, about what can the World Bank do at a key moment in our societal challenges that would be different and innovative and utilize a relationship that does not currently exist between the public sector and the private sector. I think one of the takeaways from this has been, how much do people really know about the World Bank? I thought I knew quite a bit, but actually not that much. How big is it? That's about $22 billion of capital. How much does it lend? How much does it lend? How much does it provide in equity? Well, it provides about $1.8 billion of equity a year. $1.8 billion a year. That's really small. Now, it's mostly a lender, and it's a AAA balance sheet, and it needs to keep its AAA balance sheet. So when you have to keep a AAA balance sheet, you can only take such a certain amount of risk. If your shareholders don't want you to lose that AAA, they don't want you to take more risk. So I might like them to take as much first loss as possible in order to drive the renewables revolution that we need in the global south. But maybe they don't want to take that because they don't want the risk either. So we have to think carefully about what is the level of risk that each institution is willing to take. That requires the shareholders to think differently. The United States owns 18.7% of the World Bank. How does the US think about that risk? How do we think about the prioritization? So for Ajay, as mentioned by the MD earlier, that and you can see this in a press release that the World Bank put out, they're fundamentally changing the way they think about guarantees. A piece of the World Bank called MEGA provides guarantees to the global South. And they've tripled their commitment to it, but more importantly, perhaps, they've taken each of the sections within the World Bank and standardized the guarantee. So that if you're someone working on a development project in Bolivia or in Indonesia, you no longer have to look at completely different structures, and each country isn't able to determine what that structure is going to be. That speeds the delivery of the guarantee and enables the World Bank to offload that risk to the private sector in a way that is just far less friction-filled. There are a handful of things that Ajay has decided that we should focus on, and those include how to think about foreign exchange, a topic that we could talk a lot about, or country platforms, or finally, securitization. If you're in finance, as we've been for many decades, you're used to the idea of velocity of a balance sheet. I lend money, I sell it down, I keep whatever I want if I'm a bank. Okay, velocity has been with us for the last 40 years. The idea of utilizing your balance sheet in a way that's consistent with the mandate that you have and the risk you want to take. If you're an MDB, you lend into a certain structure. Do you ever sell down? No. Yet you have demands all over the world. Why don't you sell down? Because you're the priority. You're lending to a sovereign and you're the first out. So there are all sorts of structural reasons that impede the utilization of that balance sheet. But right now, we can't afford that. We need to really innovate at all levels, in philanthropy, in the private sector, in government, and in the MDBs. We need to innovate. Otherwise, we're not going to be up to this challenge.
No, that's great. And if it's okay, I'm looking at time as well. Maybe that's a good segue into the last sector, which is the philanthropic sector. And again, Mark, if I can turn to you, you're also, in addition to the many things you do, chairman of Allied Climate Partners, right, which is a philanthropic endeavor and investment endeavor that really looks at increasing the number of bankable climate projects out there. Now, you mentioned guarantees, securitizations, and other risk mechanisms that MDBs can do, but there's also the philanthropic piece, which is quite important. If the MDBs are constrained at the moment, taking on more risk, right? The tendency is to turn to the last P sector, the philanthropic sector, and say, can you take that risk? what are the key elements of collaboration, right, that philanthropies would look at and concessional capital would look at in order to come in comfortably and participate in this way? When and where is concessional capital most meaningfully deployed?
The night before last, we heard from President Tharman about climate. He gave a really tour de force speech. One of his core 5 points was that philanthropy historically has looked to do good. It now needs to think about being risk capital, being risk capital. This is a really profound shift in what philanthropy can do. So I think from my point of view, I've already described a little bit this, so I don't want to repeat it too much. In one case, for example, at Three Karens, we've looked at creating and incubating allied climate partners, which is now going to stand up on its own as a separate entity, run by a gentleman who was a friend of many of the peoples in the room, Ahmed Saeed, who is the vice president at the Asian Development Bank until taking this role. That capital is junior. Who's senior? The MDBs of the world. And then you tee up a project, you get it ready for financing, and then the private sector comes in. Okay, in one case Actis, in one case Mitsui, other private sector actors come in. So you're trying to give each party what they're capable of doing best. And I think that's a core phenomenon. For us at Three Karens, we're focused on 3 big things in climate. Finance, I've discussed that. Carbon markets, which Singapore is a real leader in, okay? And I think that what you're doing there in terms of thinking about and building a trading capacity is super important. What we're focused on is accounting. It's amazing, you know, a carbon trade goes into an ESG statement, not onto a balance sheet that's audited. We want it to be audited by a Big 4 firm or someone like it. And then have what one of my seatmates said was fungibility. And that is the key, that you can substitute one credit for another. The third thing is talent, human talent. So we have allied talent partners. I think those are the kind of innovations and nimble approach that philanthropy can take.
Yeah, thank you. We don't think enough about talent, but it's key, right? That human capacity to move, a bit like the energy that we have in the room today. Now, thank you all. We've had a really broad-ranging discussion talking about the various sectors and the role that each of us can play. But if I can just bring us back to where we started this morning, we agreed that we need to move to action. So on that note, drawing from the many themes and ideas that we discussed in the last 40 minutes or so, what is one immediate next step that we should tackle first? I'll just ask you to go quickly, and it's just one step, that's the rule. Mark, let's start with you.
My seatmate, Ho Ching, said, eliminate subsidies on fossil fuels. I think I'll go with that.
Okay, thank you. Philip?
For us, we're very excited about the GIP acquisition, which gives us a combined equity and debt platform worldwide leading on infrastructure, and then bringing that together in a blended context by drawing in catalytic capital, either from the public side and from the philanthropic side. I think that creates a very powerful force for future vehicles where we can do what we've done on a small scale, or on a smaller scale, at scale.
Thank you. And Dylan, we'll let you have the last word.
So every one of us who's in the business world has a business that doesn't operate in isolation of the environment we're in, of the world we're in, of the communities we're in. And so we all have an obligation. If we all believe that we have a social license to operate, not just for now, but for the long run, that every one of us should be thinking of making available some part of our capital for climate change. Whichever way you want to put it. Like President Tharman said, it's risk-based capital. You can put it into energy transition. You can put it into something relating to the community, which links to improving how they can deal with climate change. For example, electric cook stoves versus gas cook stoves and things like that. But every one of us has a role to play in this issue. And if all of us start to do that and think about it, I think that we can eventually mobilize a scalable capital, because movement always gets you to the outcomes you want.
Thank you so much. So really, 3 Ps, policies, whether on coal or otherwise, platforms such as the amazing collaboration between GIP and BlackRock, and participation. Every single one of us has a role to play. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panel this morning.